Hey guys, this is Austin, and today I'm here with the top 5 failed video game consoles ever. So in the last 30 years we've seen a lot of consoles come and go. Most have been pretty good, a few have been spectacular, while the rest will be a little, we'll call them questionable. So whether this is because they were ahead of their time, because there were some poor business decisions, or just the simple fact that they sucked, here are the top 5 worst video game failures of all time. Coming in at number 5 is the Philips CDI from 1991. Now this actually wasn't strictly a game console. What they were trying to do here was actually make something that was a little bit of a computer, a little bit of a game console, and it was ahead of its time in some aspects, especially considering the fact that it used CDs well before the PlayStation 1 did. Unfortunately, the CDI wasn't a very good console or computer. Now part of this was due to the fact that since it was launched in 1991, it was in between generations, and because of this the hardware was really pretty underpowered. On top of that, this was the controller it used, so that may have played a slight role in what were they thinking? As if the $700 price tag wasn't enough, the CDI also had some licensed Nintendo games, or more specifically, The Legend of Zelda, which was horrible. It was seriously one of the worst video games of all time, making the CDI, fittingly enough, one of the worst consoles of all time. Coming in at number 4 is OnLive from 2010. Now this one actually is still technically around, so I guess we can't fully call it failed yet, but for the most part this was one of those things that was a great idea, but it was ahead of its time and pretty much crashed and burned. OnLive used what's known as cloud gaming, which meant that it was entirely limited by your internet connection. As everything was going to be rendered and all the games were being run on some server somewhere, if you had a decent internet connection, it actually was not half bad. However, and this was the big part, you still had to deal with a little bit of lag, as every time you hit a button, it wasn't just going 3 feet to your console, it was going 5, 10, 100, maybe even 1,000 miles to the nearest OnLive station. Unless you had an amazing internet connection, OnLive was really difficult to work with. All it took was someone in the house to start watching Netflix or downloading something, and you would start seeing lag in your game, and it would even start to get lower quality, and just it did not work very well. Now when OnLive was first being announced and before it actually came out, it was valued at up to $1.8 billion. However, a short 2 years later when it actually went under, it sold for more like $4 million. Coming in at number 3 is the Apple Pippin from 1995. Now this is the first and only console Apple ever designed, and just like the CDI, it wasn't strictly for games, as there were other applications that were available on the console. The Pippin was mostly based on Macs of the time, just cut down to a console-like form factor. Now while there were advantages to this, one of the big disadvantages was price, as it was $600 brand new. In a time where there was the amazing PlayStation 1 for much less than that, it made the Pippin a really tough sell. While the Pippin saw some very mild success, mostly thanks to Bandai who actually licensed it and created quite a few of these consoles, for the most part it was a flop, and as soon as Steve Jobs came back to Apple, it was one of the first things axed. At number 2, we have the Nintendo Virtual Boy from 1995. Now on paper this looks really impressive, even by today's standards. It was a bit of goggles as well as a controller that allowed you to see 3D images and play games and everything, and it looked really cool, except that, well, imagine what 3D and virtual reality looked like with 1995 technology. Not particularly good. The Virtual Boy could only display the color red, and the graphics were very simple, making the 3D effect not quite as good as it could be. On top of that, just like with the Nintendo 3DS of today, the 3D effect gave a lot of people headaches. As you might expect, at $180, the Virtual Boy didn't last too long, as it sold well under 1 million units, and Nintendo quickly pulled the plug to go back to making piles of money with the Nintendo 64. Lastly, at number 1, we have the Sega Dreamcast from 1998. Unlike the rest of the failed consoles on this list, the Dreamcast was actually one of the best of all time. It just so happened to sink Sega's hardware business in the meantime. The Dreamcast was ahead of its time in several ways. For example, it was the very first console to include a modem, which allowed you to play online games years before Xbox Live and the PlayStation Network ever showed up. There were other good ideas as well, including the fact that the controllers had the memory card slots. Now while this wasn't anything amazing, what was cool was the fact that the controllers actually had buttons and a screen, which meant that of course you could go and load up all your data and everything like that, but some of them actually had mini games that you could play straight on your memory card. While the Dreamcast didn't have a long lifespan, it did have a ton of potential, and in fact a lot of what they worked on for the Dreamcast was moved on to the Xbox, and we all know how that one turned out. Anyway, I'm curious to know, what's the worst video game console you guys have ever used? Definitely be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed, definitely be sure to check out the last episode where I went over the top 5 worst phones ever. If you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave this video a thumbs up, and if you're interested in more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. Anyway guys, I will catch you next time.